Resolve. This is the Friendly Neighborhood History channel, and I will be bringing you my weekly Q&A, Ask Me Anything, talking about different historical topics that I want to talk about and anything you want to talk about. And thank you for joining and all your support. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Give me any feedback you want, any video ideas or topics you want me to cover. And of course, in the comments, you can leave any sort of feedback, ask any questions, or just talk about history. That's what we're here to do. And obviously, I try to start the Q&A going by talking about topics that are interesting to me and occurring to me that I find to have historical relevance. And so that is what we are going to do at the beginning. And if you have any questions or historical information you want me to go over, feel free to do so. All right, so the big news today, obviously, and I don't want to get too much into politics, but this is definitely a historical moment for the United States, is that President Joe Biden has decided to drop out of the presidential race. Now, a lot of people think that he is resigning and Vice President Kamala Harris has become the first female president. That is not what has happened. She is more likely than not the favorite in the Democratic Party now to run the show for Biden and to be the nominee and to face off against Donald Trump and the Republicans in November. Biden will still be president for the rest of his term until January, when he steps aside, either for Harris or probably for Trump. Who knows how that actually is going to play out. But anyways, that's what's going on right now. And very interesting news. We haven't had a president drop out of a presidential race in quite some time. It is really fascinating. And a lot of people were wondering if this would happen. This has been a question for several years due to the president's age and concerns about his mental acuity, which reared their ugly head at the most recent presidential debate between him and Trump, where Biden did not perform that well at all and really kind of made a lot of people, even on his own side, even on media that is sympathetic to him, question whether or not he should continue to stay in the race. And obviously that did not happen. So a lot going on, so a lot changing in American history. So I wanted to talk about the politics and the history of presidential campaigns and presidents not running for a second term, as Biden becomes the first president to not run for a second term since Lyndon Johnson in 1968, who dropped out of the presidential race after a poor showing in the New Hampshire primary and a regrettable and difficult situation due to the Vietnam War and other civil strife going on in the country at the time. The 60s were a very divisive era, especially 1968, and all of that, very, very divisive year. You could write an entire book, as people have done many times, about how historically significant 1968 is. So there's a lot going on there. Anyways, so Biden dropping out of the presidential race, first president to do it in a long time, and maybe the first president to ever drop out of a presidential race due to his age. Presidents in the past have dropped off due to unpopularity or feelings that they couldn't continue to do the job. Health concerns have stopped men from running for second terms for president, but this might be the first time that age and concerns of mental decline have caused a candidate to drop out of the presidential race. The first instance, presidents have often sought second terms, and the earliest examples we have of presidents not seeking second terms comes from the 1840s. In 1841, William Henry Harrison became president and died in office a month later after insisting on giving a speech to prove that he was not old. At the time, he was 68, the oldest president ever elected. He gave a speech in the cold, driving rain that lasted an hour and a half, his inaugural address. He caught a cold that turned into pneumonia, and he died. His vice president, John Tyler, took over after him, and Tyler became really unpopular with the Whig Party, and the Democrat Party, which was existent back then, did not trust him or believe that he would do a good enough job. So by 1844, Tyler was dropped. He didn't get to run for a term in his own right. Right after that, James Polk became president, and Polk became the first president to actively choose not to seek a second term. He said he would only serve one term, and he said it when he was nominated and elected in 1844. So in 1848, he didn't run, despite having a very successful presidency. He is the president who actually completed Sea to Shining Sea by getting us California and the Northwest by due to the Mexican-American War and an agreement with Great Britain, which actually settled the Canadian border at the 49th parallel. So Polk chose not to run, but he chose way ahead of time, and also due to health reasons, as Polk was very unhealthy and died shortly after his presidency actually ended. In 1852, Millard Fillmore, who had been president for a couple of years and had become very unpopular was not nominated by the Whigs to run for president, and so he served less than one term, having succeeded for Taylor, who died in office. The first active example in American history of a president not getting a second term after being elected to a first one was in 1856, when the Democrats refused to nominate Franklin Pierce after all of his failed years as president. Pierce had passed through the unpopular Kansas-Nebraska Act, which had led to a lot of bloodshed and fighting amongst pro and anti-slavery forces in Kansas and Nebraska, and had divided the nation and basically helped cause the Civil War. Pierce's ineptitude was so great, and the chasm and divide in the country was so big, that congressmen were actually attacking each other in the Capitol building in 1856. Okay, yes. Thank you again for joining, everyone, and make sure to leave a like and comments and feedback. I will be answering any questions you have about history, any content referring to that, and I really appreciate all your feedback and your attendance and everything. But basically, so Pierce didn't run for a second term in 1856, and then James Buchanan was elected right after Pierce, and he was an elder statesman, very experienced, had served in the presidential cabinets, had served in the House and the Senate, and a lot of people have actually compared him to Biden because of his experience and advanced age as well. Buchanan was in his mid-60s, and back then that was very advanced in age. And Buchanan chose not to serve a second term, just like Polk did when he first ran, but Buchanan was so unpopular and did such a disastrous job handling the divisions over slavery that no one would have voted for him for a second term. And the Democrat Party actually split in two between Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats, and this allowed Lincoln to win in 1860, which my Daily President videos, today's video will be about Lincoln. That'll be a full-length video dropping later on today. So I hope you all check that out. So you have those presidents, and then you have Andrew Johnson, who becomes president after Lincoln is shot and killed. Johnson is a former Democrat who kind of becomes a Republican, but is not trusted by the Republicans in Congress and is not very popular. Often considered to be the worst president in American history, Johnson is actually the first president to be impeached for violating a law Congress passed. And due to this, he was not anyone's choice in 1868, so he doesn't run for a second term. Moving forward, you got Ulysses Grant right after that, who gets 2 terms. Lincoln was elected to a second term and died early in his second term, by the way. But then in 1876, the Republicans nominate and barely elect Rutherford B. Hayes in one of the closest elections in American history, probably even closer than the notorious 2000 election. And Hayes was thinking about getting a second term, but really stuck to his own promise, once again, like Polk and Buchanan, of only serving 1 term as president. So he's out. He's succeeded by a man named James Garfield, who I was talking about yesterday in the live stream, who was one of the 4 presidents to be assassinated. And Garfield's vice president takes over, Chester Arthur, and although being a relatively competent president, Arthur's health, like Polk, keeps him from running for a second term in 1884, so he bows out of getting a term in his own right. And he's a president who assumed the presidency because a president had died, just like Fillmore and Johnson. So he didn't even actually get elected to a term to serve as president. He got elected as vice president. So you've so far only got really one example of a guy who was elected president who did not go for a second term and was passed over, and that's Franklin Pierce. And then you have 2 others, Polk and Buchanan, who chose, and 3 others, Hayes too, who chose not to run for a second term. Biden did run for a second term, obviously made it very far through the campaign and the primary season and almost to the convention before dropping out. So we move along. We actually have a long strand of presidents after that who at least ran for a second term. Some were not elected, some served only 1 term, but usually they were their party's nominee, and it hasn't occurred for a long time that a president has actually dropped out. And for about 80 years, you have a president at least running for a second term, if not getting elected to a second term. You have presidents who die in office, so they don't get to go for a second term, but then the person who succeeds them runs for a term in their own right. So Warren Harding dies in 1923 of a heart attack, although there is a rumor that his wife poisoned him. And after his death, Calvin Coolidge takes over and becomes the U.S. president, and Coolidge runs for a term. He's the president of the Roaring Twenties and wins in 1924. Then you have to go all the way forward, and I made a video about this today and talked about it, to 1968, one of the most notorious years in American history. And this is when Johnson chooses not to run due to the Vietnam War, due to his unpopularity. And he shows a terrible performance in the New Hampshire primary against fellow Democrats like Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy, who run against him, and he drops out of the race. Kennedy is the odds-on favorite from there out, not just to win the Democratic Party nomination, but the presidency. And Kennedy actually is unfortunately assassinated in June, and this leads to the Democrats deciding in their convention, which is in Chicago, just like the convention here, to select Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president. Once again, just like Kamala Harris is likely to be the selection for the Democrats at their convention to be the vice president, you have Hubert Humphrey in the same position in 1968. Humphrey is tied too closely to Johnson and Johnson's failures in Vietnam and the domestic upheaval going on in the country, and this allows Nixon to win the election in November. And a lot of people think that might very well be the case, as Donald Trump will probably try to tie Harris to Biden, who he believes to be a failure as president. So that's just a little bit of history about presidents stepping down. This is a historic day, and again, this is probably the first time that a president has actually stepped down due to his concerns about his age and his mental acuity, which has been a concern for a lot of people. It's been something that Republicans and people on the right have used to attack him over the last few decades, or actually the last few years. And it is something that people in his own party have been somewhat in denial about until very recently. And now it has become something very clear, and pressures from his own party to drop out seem rather historic themselves, as you have the former Speaker of the House, the current Senate Majority Leader, and others saying that Biden may not be able to win the election against Trump in November, and that leads to Biden dropping out as he did today. So obviously huge news. We haven't seen this before in American history in the exact same way, and we do have a little bit of history repeating itself. This is very similar to '68. The convention is even in the same city. The Republicans already have their candidate, and it's likely going to be the vice president, the Democratic vice president, just as it was in 1968. And so you've got history, as Mark Twain said, not repeating, but rhyming a lot. And so there's people always ask me about when does history repeat itself, and history has a lot of similarities, a lot of things going on, but it doesn't always it's not always exactly the same, but a lot of the times the patterns are the same. So that's what happened today. That's the big breaking news. Obviously, both of my live streams the last 2 weeks have been focusing on big breaking news. Obviously, with Trump's assassination attempt, I went into the history of presidential assassinations last week, and now with Biden dropping out of the race, I've gone into the history of presidents not seeking or getting a second term. And of course, there's a lot more presidents than the presidents I talked about who ran for a second term and did not win it. The most recent example of this is obviously Trump, and before him, George Bush in the 1990s. So moving forward, meanwhile, also historically, there's only been one president, speaking of Trump, who has served twice at different times, and that was Grover Cleveland, who was the 22nd president, lost, came back, and won again, and became the 24th president, and Trump is trying to do that exact same thing now in 2024. So that's a little bit about what I wanted to talk about. Talking about the age of the presidents, Biden is the only president who has served into his 80s. He will be 82 at the end of his term. And there has been concerns about his age, as there have been for presidents who were of advanced age. William Henry Harrison was obviously the first one with concerns about his age, like I mentioned earlier, being 68. And he died in office because he was trying to prove that he wasn't too old. So he gave a speech that in a cold driving rain, got a cold, turned into pneumonia, and he died. Reagan was in his 70s, most notably, and there were a lot of questions about his age, and near the end of his term, there was a lot of evidence and worry and rumor that Reagan was already struggling with Alzheimer's disease, which he would for the rest of his life. And Trump, when he was elected, was already 70. And if he gets reelected, he will be 78 when he comes to power. So American presidents and their age have been a concern for a long time. This is not something new, and America has seen historic things like this happen all the time. And like I said, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme a lot. So that's something going on. I wanted to talk a little bit more. I was talking yesterday in the live stream that really got kind of mushed up and thrown all over the place, and I finally had to just cancel and call it. I was talking a little bit about the causes of World War I, and I just find this to be one of the most fascinating topics in history. And I want to talk about the actual fighting of World War I. Basically, World War I happens because a bunch of different European powerhouses, Germany, France, Russia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Great Britain all have treaties against each other, and basically one domino falls over and then all the dominoes fall over. And so a domino effect leads to World War I, where you have Germany and Austro-Hungary fighting Russia in the east, as well as France in the West and Great Britain. Most of the fighting that we know about from World War I, we focus on the Western Front and trench warfare, which was really common during World War I, where men were literally dying thousands at a time just so that their side could advance a few inches when they would go out of the trenches and try to gain ground on their enemy in different offensives. So you also have the uses of new technologies that make the war particularly brutal: poison gas, barbed wire. Obviously, machine guns have been used in wars before, but they have pretty efficient machine guns going on at this time that really make things a lot harder. There seems to be somebody playing music in the background, and I don't know what song it is, but it sounds sweet. Almost sounds Disney-esque, I don't know. Anyways, so you've got that going on, barbed wire, and the British actually halfway through the war invent a new giant truck that they can use against their enemy, and they call it the tank. The reason they call it the tank is because they don't want the Germans to know what it is. And the tank was actually very effective at going over the trenches and destroying enemy troops and artillery. This is also a war full of heavy artillery. And the problem with the tank, though, is it's always shutting down, and the tanks we know and think about often, you really don't get that form of a tank until World War II. Hello, welcome. So there's a lot of new inventions in World War I. There's even submarines. The German U-boats sink a lot of ships, even American ships, bringing supplies and probably weapons to the British, who the Germans are trying to blockade in the middle of the war. It's actually the sinking of a ship, the Lusitania, which includes the death of many American passengers, which really puts pressure on President Wilson of the United States to get involved in World War I. But like I said yesterday, the U.S. doesn't get involved until the Zimmerman telegram, which is where Germany promises Mexico that they will give them back the American Southwest if they invade the United States. And so Wilson, who had ran for re-election in 1916 on the promise that he wasn't going to get America involved in another war, got America involved in a war right after that election. Just politics 101, I guess. But anyways, so you've got the German submarines, which are really dangerous. You've got airplanes and dogfights. These are the first where different fighter planes will go very close to each other and try to fire machine gun fire from their planes at each other. So there's a lot going on in terms of new warfare and stuff like that in World War I. New technologies and things. Mustard gas is used, and that is horrifyingly consequential and leads to all sorts of scarring and terrible results and diseases for the men who are exposed to it. So you'll see a lot of pictures of World War I guys wearing gas masks and things like that, like you would see in a Fallout game. At the same time, you also have, this is actually what injured Hitler. Hitler was fighting on the front lines for Germany, was injured, and when he was in recovery, he actually found out that Germany had lost the war and was never able to accept the fact that that Germany had lost that war. So he obviously just bows out. So anyways, I'm gonna move away because the music's getting louder, but it's actually, you know what, never mind. I like it. It's kind of good background. Hopefully it doesn't get too loud so you can't hear my voice. Anyways, at the same time, you also have, so you've got planes, you've got heavy artillery, you've got machine guns, you've got submarines, you've got poison gas, you've got all of these crazy things that people have used. The products of the Industrial Revolution, of mass production, of heavy machinery, are now being used by the very same people who made them to kill each other. And you have millions of people dying, you have environmental disaster and devastation, and you have basically the souls of a lot of young people, even if they don't die, even if they're not injured in war, just decimated. And a lot of these men sitting in the trenches, hearing artillery fire go off time and time again, develop a psychological condition called shell shock, where they are traumatized and just, overburdened by what had happened. And this is where we get post-traumatic stress disorder, which probably had been occurring in wars for thousands of years, but this was the first official time that they actually looked at what happened to troops' psyches, to the psyche of the soldiers, and said this is an actual condition, that they are so overburdened by warfare that they actually have what's called shell shock. And of course later we changed that to post-traumatic stress disorder. So a lot going on there. You've got soldiers suffering in terrible, terrible ways. And obviously a lot of people getting mutilated, losing arms and legs, eyes, noses, ears, things like that, and then living the rest of their lives feeling forgotten and left over. And a lot of people don't really see the point in World War I, and a lot of the history that's written about World War I sees it as a pointless war where basically elites and upper class leaders threw millions of men to die at each other just for small gains of land that really didn't really change much. But the truth of the matter is that World War I did change a lot. World War I, a lot of people will say, and I actually don't really subscribe to this argument, that World War I causes World War II. And of course at the time they didn't know that there would be a World War II, so they called it the Great War. So there was a lot of people who were dissatisfied with the ending of the Great War. And the argument is that Germany was punished so severely after World War I, and they were forced at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 to agree that they had been the ones who were fully guilty for causing the war, which is really not true. It was really a mix of aggression from the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians, and Germany may have been the most aggressive, pushing the Austro-Hungarians to attack the Serbians, knowing the Russians would attack the Serbians, and then they could attack the Russians, which would bring in France and later Great Britain and cause all of the colonies of these empires to go to war, causing a world war. But that's not the point. The point is that Germany accepting full blame for the war was harsh and unfair. They also had to pay back horrendous war debt, which ruined the German economy in the 1920s because they were printing money just to pay back their war debt, which caused hyperinflation, and basically people could barely afford bread. So at the same time, a lot of people think that because Germany was treated so harshly, this created a level of national resentment and anger by the Germans, and they held on to this grief and anger until the 1930s, and that's how the Nazis were able to come to power, by tapping into that anger, and the Nazis used this to take control of Germany and obviously cause World War II and the Holocaust. And there is some historical precedent for this, and there's some truth to it, but usually, as you will find if you study history, there's not always one blanket answer for everything. There is always nuance and shades of meaning, and if you actually study German history closely in the 1920s and 30s, Germany had economically recovered by the end of the 1920s. They were no longer suffering from hyperinflation, and they were actually stabilizing and getting better relations with their former enemies, France and Great Britain especially. And a lot of people thought that Germany would just get back into the swing of things. And it was actually the United States that had helped Germany stabilize. Charles Dawes, who later became the American vice president, created this plan to loan Germany money so that they could pay back their war debt. And of course it was a loan with interest, and the United States got very wealthy from it. The United States also had gotten France and Britain to borrow a bunch of money from them to pay for their war. So France, Britain, and Germany were paying America back for World War I, basically. This allowed the American economy to be so vibrant in the 1920s, partly at least. But anyway, so Germany's economy was getting better, their society was getting better, and their international prestige was restoring itself. It's really not until the Great Depression ruins the German economy, and because of all the loans and debts, more so, much more so than Britain, France, and even the United States, as bad as the Great Depression was in America. So because of this, the Germans are really in a bad spot in the early 1930s, and this allows radical groups such as the communists and the Nazis to really gain national prestige and attention, and that leads obviously to World War II and the Holocaust. So there are some indirect causes, and there's definitely Hitler and the Nazis tapping into the national resentment, saying if it wasn't for World War I, if it wasn't, okay, thanks. I appreciate that. My lips are badly chapped, so you probably don't want to do that. But anyways, if it wasn't for World War I, if it wasn't for Versailles, if it wasn't for how the other Europeans bullied us, then Germany would be great and would be powerful. And that is only, and of course, like the Nazis and Hitler do all the time, they lie. That is a lie. There's a little bit of truth in it, covered up by the rest by a lie. It wasn't France and Britain's fault that Germany was in the economic deprivation it was, at least not fully their fault. But Hitler basically stopped paying off war debt and started rebuilding the German military and employed everybody to do this, and that's how he fixed the German economy. And of course, the trade-off for that was an authoritarian government and all the other horrible things the Nazis did. So Basically, World War I doesn't necessarily cause World War II, and World War II could have been avoided. A lot of people, when they talk about history, will say, because this happened, therefore this is inevitable, and therefore this was going to happen and bound to happen. And there's some truth that history is connected. There's a lot of patterns and, like I said, not repeating, but rhyming. And there's a lot of connections in history, and there's a lot of things going on, and things do cause other things. But there's not a lot of inevitability. Nobody expected World War II to happen in the 1930s. The only one who really saw it coming, at least when it came to the side of the Allies, Britain and France, was Churchill. And Churchill advised Britain and France not to let Hitler do what he wanted, and he realized that Hitler was an existential threat. He also believed that the Soviet Union was an existential threat to Britain and the West. So Hitler was kind of ahead of the ball on a lot of that, but inevitability is not a guarantee in history. There was no inevitability that World War II would be caused by World War I. There was a very famous French general, I believe it was Ferdinand Foch, who led the French army during World War I, who said at the Treaty of Versailles, after reviewing everything the treaty said, in 20 years, there will be another war. It's an eerie and uncanny prediction. But basically, that's a very good prediction, and I could see how he could maybe look at these things and see it. And in hindsight, we always look back at history and say, oh yeah, obviously this was going to cause that, right? But that's not exactly how it happens. A lot of the time what happens, you have unforeseen events coming up, surprises, twists and turns. I started off today's Q&A by talking about twists and turns. You have the twist and turn with President Biden, and that's going to change history. And we don't know how it's going to impact history, and historians are going to be studying it for decades about how it impacted history, the 2024 election, and so on. So because history is connected, a lot of people can look back and see, oh, this was obvious, and say it was inevitable, but that doesn't mean that it was inevitable. History is oftentimes not inevitable. But the groundwork for World War II in some ways was laid by World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles, a lot of people focus on, that's the German agreement, but there was actually an agreement that broke down the Austro-Hungarian Empire, another one that broke down the Ottoman Empire. Basically, 4 empires die. And the old European order is done away with and forever changed because of this. So that's one of the big changes from World War I. And although you have millions of people dying, and all of this upheaval isn't going to lead to no change at all. So first off, you have the German Empire collapsing. The Kaiser abdicates and abandons his people and runs away with his mistress after World War I. He later becomes a fan of Hitler and the Nazis, believing they will make Germany great again. Where'd I get that from? Anyways, the Austro-Hungarians also, they collapse as an empire and are separated. Basically, Austria-Hungary is this empire that has a bunch of different people living in their borders who work for all sorts of different groups. You have different ethnic groups, Czechs, Slovaks, Serbs, Hungarians, Poles, Germans, and they all want to speak their own language and live in their own culture and have their own country. And when Austria-Hungary is broken down, they allow this to happen. Poland is recreated after being controlled by Germany and Russia for so many centuries. Poland becomes a country again. Czechoslovakia becomes a country. Yugoslavia, where they basically throw all the Slavic peoples together from Bosnia and areas like that and create Yugoslavia. The Russian Empire is dissolved not in any of the treaties, but due to the Russian Revolution, which is partly caused by World War I. Basically, the Russians do very poorly in World War I. They don't have the trench warfare and the new technology of the Western Front in France, between Britain and France against Germany, but they do have large amounts of land that they can retreat and reinvade, and Russia basically does very well against Austria-Hungary, who is not nearly as developed and doesn't have nearly the manpower that Russia does. But Germany's advanced technology and advanced military tactics basically hand the Russians their butt on a platter. And so Russia does very, very poorly during the war. And now a dog is singing along in the chorus, just great. But anyways, so the Russians do really poorly. Their Tsar takes over their army with no military experience, with no reason to do so, just because he thinks that he is the only one who can solve the problems of the Russian people, and he solves nothing. The Russian army doesn't collapse, but really continues to deal with defeat after defeat, and this eventually prompts the generals to pressure Tsar Nicholas to resign. And meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, there's actually riots and the beginning of what will become known as the February Revolution, which actually occurs in March of 1917, but because the Russians are on the Julian calendar instead of the Gregorian, they're 2 weeks behind the rest of the world, technically, according to their calendar. So this actually happens in Russia in February, but it's March in the United States and Germany and France. So anyways, so the Russians, so rioting and revolution in St. Petersburg, which was called Petrograd at the time, spreads throughout the country. There's a lot of mutiny in the army and the navy, and the Tsar's generals basically, what was I going to say? The Tsar's generals basically convince him to resign and drop out, and he tries to put his brother and then his son, who has a bleeding disease and is only 13, on the throne, and neither of them want to do that, and so Nicholas just leaves the Russian throne empty, basically ending the Russian Empire, which becomes a government. And the government at first tries to keep, it's a provisional government, they try to keep Russia in the war. That doesn't go so well, basically, and eventually they lose support by continuing to back the war and continuing to at the same time insult and isolate the military, who would support them from radicals, and the radical strike led by Lenin and his Bolsheviks. And in October, actually November, but October according to the Julian calendar, the Russians, the Bolsheviks take over and they end the Russian Empire officially and basically take Russia out of the war. So basically what you've got going on is the end of that empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is broken up into a bunch of different countries, and Germany, having lost the war and having been given all this war debt, their emperor flees, and they create a new government in the city of Weimar because Berlin was too dangerous and too full of revolutionaries and dissenters, and that's where we get what's called the Weimar Republic. So you've got three empires collapsing. The fourth and final one is the Ottoman Empire, and basically the Ottomans had done pretty well in the war defending their own land. Throughout the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had been in a rapid series of decline and had lost a lot of the land in southeastern Europe that eventually became part of Austro-Hungary and Russia and countries like Serbia. The Greeks gained their independence from the Ottomans. And so a lot of people in Europe believe the Ottomans were just weak and could be bullied, and they were called the sick man of Europe. The Ottomans tried to get better and to get well by helping Germany and Austro-Hungary, thinking they could restore their prestige. And they do well at first. The Allies, led by Churchill of all people, who's at this time working for the Navy in Britain, try to launch an invasion of the coast of the Dardanelles. It's called Gallipoli. It goes terribly. And so the Ottomans do well at first, but eventually the British help the Arabs, the Saudis, the Saudi Arabians, fight off their Ottoman oppressors, and that really weakens the Ottoman Empire, and they eventually collapse after World War I, and Turkey becomes its own country, an own republic, and then you have Arabia becoming its own country, and you have several countries in southeastern Europe getting more land and more national identity and stuff like that, and then you have Britain and France basically carving up the Middle East, which is where we get some of the problems we have there today. In fact, when it comes to carving up territories and setting up boundaries, the Europeans did this in a bunch of places. The British divided Pakistan from India. They also set the boundary between Afghanistan and Pakistan. The French and British, like I just said, carve up the Middle East, and obviously one of the biggest issues there was the carving up of the Mandate of Palestine, which the British, starting in 1917, said that the Jewish people deserved to have a homeland there. You also have the issue of the Palestinians who were there and Jews who have been moving there, and attempts at the beginning attempts of a two-state solution that no one has figured out even to this day, which explains why the war in Israel and Gaza is going on right now. Which, of course, again, this is all history. This is all connections and causation, and nothing just appears out of a vacuum out of nowhere. There are reasons for this, and the reasons can go back way farther in history than you might anticipate. My video yesterday, my full-length video that dropped that I wanted to talk about, to change the topic ever so slightly, was about Africa and how we talk about dividing up boundaries and borders. The Europeans divide up Africa into a bunch of different countries, basically smushing together different tribes with different religions, beliefs, who sometimes actually hate each other, different customs and practices, and forcing them to be part of one single country. And the Europeans did this in the 1880s without any permission or input from the Africans. It's called the Berlin Conference, and it's how Africa gets the divisions, the border divisions, more or less that it has now, although those have changed slightly ever since the end of the European occupation of African countries in the 1950s and 60s. So basically, World War I changes everything. And the Africans and other colonies see the fighting, and they are actually part of the fighting. There is fighting in Africa because Germany has territories there, and so do the British and the French. There are Indian troops who are going to Europe to fight and help the British. China and Japan will get involved, attacking, because the Germans are so aggressive that China and Japan are fighting against the Germans during World War I. Japan obviously would change a lot by World War II, and one of the reasons Japan joins the Axis powers in Italy during World War II is because they don't get nearly the rewards they thought they deserved for helping the British, the French, and the Americans during World War I. There's a lot going on in World War I that does, chickens do come home to roost during World War II. But anyway, so there's a lot of colonial areas that are fighting and helping their colonial overlords, the British and the French colonies in Africa fighting against the German colonies there, and so on. And basically, after all the devastation of modern warfare, Europe, and this happens in World War I, and especially after World War II, all of the British and the French and their colonies basically say, you believe that you're a civilized people. You believed you were civilizing us. You believed we were inferior racially and societally. But look at what you've done. Look at the devastation of your world wars. Look at how many people have died. You really don't know what you're talking about. We deserve to have our own freedoms. So it had been going on before, but after World War I, there are greater cries for independence for a lot of the colonies, including India. In fact, right after World War I in 1922, the southern part of Ireland becomes its own country again. And so you start to see the slow but steady ending of these empires. In fact, by 1920, due to their influence and control in the Middle East, Britain and France reached the largest of their territorial extents. By 1960, both of their empires are collapsing at a rapid rate. So World War I does change a lot. It encourages the native peoples of these colonized areas to seek for their own independence and seek their own opportunities. What Woodrow Wilson calls self-determination, that the peoples of a country have a right to create their own nation state and to create their own government and to try out democracy. And he really pushes this idea in the Balkans, in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, and in Eastern Europe. But this is later applied after World War II to Africa and India and Southeast Asia and other places. Another result of World War I, interestingly enough, is the beginning of what we call supranationalism. Supranationalism is the idea that basically governments around the world need not only work together when it's convenient for them, but all the time to establish trade, to create political stability, and to avoid war. And so this is actually the brainchild. He's not the first one to think of it, but Woodrow Wilson has this idea for a League of Nations. And he thinks the League of Nations can prevent another great war, basically. And the way the League of Nations work is you have different members of a country being represented there, and when you have disputes, they work it out peacefully without condemning each other. They assume the goodwill of the other countries, and again, they work together for peace. The League of Nations becomes very popular with the Europeans, and although Wilson had told Britain and France to take it easy on Germany, which Britain and France ignored, Wilson's idea for the League of Nations they find to be a great idea, and so they adopt it. And really, for the next 20 years, the former allies and the foreign policy of Europe and even the United States is going to be, let's avoid another one of these at all costs, even when Germany, Japan, and Italy are militantly aggressive and rearming and things like that. Italy, by the way, during World War I had originally been allied with Germany and Austro-Hungary, but never got involved and turned on them, thinking that the Allies would give them something better. So they actually fought with Britain, France, and the United States. They don't get rewarded for anything they do. They have an economic depression, just like the rest of Europe, basically. a short one after World War I, and this leads to the rise of the fascists in Italy. But anyways, so even when Germany, Italy, and Japan are rearming and aggressively pursuing colonization and expansion, the rest of the Allies will try everything in their power to, again, appease their enemies and keep them from saying, you can have this, but not that. Just please stop here, don't go any further. We condemn these actions, please stop. And eventually Hitler pushes it so far when he goes into Poland that Britain and France ultimately decide that they will have to go to war. They hope and pray it's not another war like the Great War, and it is. It's even more cataclysmic and far-reaching with much more human suffering. But anyways, so the League of Nations is created to preserve world peace, and it fails at its job. And a lot of people think it fails at its job because the United States, which is now, after World War I, neck and neck with Britain as the greatest world power, a lot of people believe that the United States not joining the League of Nations actually is the reason that it fails and World War II happens. This isn't, again, you can't just say this causes that, black and white, but there is something to be said for the fact that the United States, under Woodrow Wilson, really pushed to join the League of Nations, but the Republican Senate, who were tired of foreign intervention, vote against approving the treaty. Wilson gives a speaking tour across the United States. He ends up having a stroke and is actually incapacitated, and this is before what we call the 25th Amendment, which allows the vice president to take over not only if the president dies, but if he becomes incapacitated. But basically, Wilson's wife actually, with him ailing and very sick, she does a lot of what the president does. So a lot of people have said, I believe it's Edith Wilson? Edith Wilson is the first female president, at least de facto. It's an interesting historical argument. Anyways, so Wilson actually, he fails in his attempt. He's unwilling to work with the Republican Senate even after the stroke, and they turn down the League of Nations, so the United States does not join. So Britain and France are the main principal partners in the League of Nations. And the problem with this group, a lot of people have argued, is that it did not include the United States. And because it did not include the United States, you were able to see the unmitigated rise of Nazi Germany and aggressive Imperial Japan and Italy, which did a lot of human atrocities. We talk normally about what Japan does. We talk mainly about Germany. Obviously, the Holocaust stands out. But also we talk a little bit about Japan and their war crimes in China and the Philippines and their aggressive invasions of China and Southeast Asia during World War II. But a lot of people don't talk about that leading up to and even including World War II, the Italians were merciless, and this ties back into Africa. The Italians had gotten Libya when Africa had been divided, but Ethiopia was one of the two African countries that had remained independent, and different European powers over the years had tried to take it over. Yes, America is yes, I absolutely agree. America is a country of extremely high cost of living. Yes, it is not a cheap place to live. So please like and subscribe so that I can monetize and afford living here. But anyways, and if you're just joining, this is a Q&A. I know I'm lecturing quite a bit, but feel free to ask any questions about history or about the channel. I'm happy to answer them at any point. But anyways, so the United States, where was I? Oh, not the United States, Italy. So Italy had wanted Ethiopia for some time, had tried to get their hands on it, and Mussolini believes that in order to revive the Roman Empire, which is at the center of his, his desire, he believes that to make Italy great, he needs to revive the Roman Empire. Interestingly enough, Hitler also and the Nazis call Germany the Third Reich, which refers back to the Roman Empire as well. But nonetheless, Mussolini believes that he needs colonies in Africa. Okay, I wouldn't go that far with French fries. You can find cheap fries. There are places to find cheap papas fritas in America, I promise you. Anyways, so Hitler basically believes that he will be, Mussolini basically believes that in order to revive the Italian Empire to its former glory, he needs to take land. He takes some land in Southeast Europe, the Balkans, same areas in World War I. Most notably, he annexes Albania. But he also goes into Ethiopia, and he overthrows the Ethiopian ruler Haile Selassie. Selassie goes before the League of Nations and condemns what Mussolini is doing and tries to draw attention to this. And Mussolini does this in 1936. This is before Hitler even takes over Austria and Czechoslovakia way before he goes into Poland and starts World War II. And this is before the Chinese are attacked by the Japanese at the Marco Polo Bridge in 1937, which a lot of people would argue is a better start date for World War II than 1939 or 1941 when the U.S. got involved. But anyway, so Mussolini goes into Ethiopia, and basically the Italians continually encounter resistance from the Ethiopians. And in order to deal with this continual resistance, the Italians repress them. They kill them, they torture them, they imprison them, and yet they don't break their spirit. And the Ethiopians continue to strive to be a free African people, as many other African countries had done. And the Ethiopians are ultimately successful, and when Mussolini's government collapses, Ethiopia becomes a free country again. And by 1944, Selassie is back in charge. But Mussolini's government, once again, gets by the League of Nations. Hitler thwarts the League of Nations, and Japan's aggression in East Asia isn't answered until World War II. Yes, chemical weapons definitely did help. I was just talking about earlier in the feed about chemical weapons being used during World War I, the Great War. That was very common. And there is definitely the use of that in World War II. Firebombing's very common. And of course you get from this the human tragedy in Dresden, when the United States and Britain firebomb a city with no military sites whatsoever. So a city full of civilians. Anyways, so the League of Nations really doesn't get the success that it... they use chemical weapons against the Ethiopians. The Italians? Yes, I remember hearing something about that. That sounds about right. I think you're correct. I should have mentioned that. Yes. Listen to none of your business. He knows what he's talking about. Anyways, so... chemical weapons, obviously, used in World War I, used again in World War II. Somebody's asking, what do you think about Vivek Ramaswamy for president? Well, he already ran, and he didn't get anywhere, and he might run again in the future, but I don't know. I try to stay out of the politics and just talk about the history. Ramaswamy was trying to run a campaign that was similar to Trump, and he didn't catch fire as much because there's only one Trump, and he kind of runs the GOP anyways. They brought Senegalese Americans to New York who worked all day with a sandwich and a bottle of Coke, the slaves. Interesting. I've never heard of that before. That's an interesting reality. Anyways, getting back to it. So the League of Nations failed to stop... yeah, it does suck. And it sucks, and a lot of people think it sucks because the United States is not involved in it. It can't stop Mussolini in Africa. It can't stop Japan and its many human rights abuses in East Asia, in China in particular. It's pretty brutal what they do in Nanjing. And it can't stop, obviously, the biggest, the most infamous one, the Nazis and Germany and their extension into Eastern Europe and Central Europe. And so by the end of World War II, once again, the United States, this time not the president, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, devises an idea for a United Nations to replace the League of Nations. And basically, the United Nations is stronger, it has a military, it is more militaristic and able to create a military coalition. And the reason it works, and the reason a lot of people argue to this day that it works, is because, yes, they practically gave Czechoslovakia. Well, they agreed to give Hitler part of Czechoslovakia, where he said there were a lot of German people, and then Hitler took over the rest of Czechoslovakia and they did nothing. And that's really Britain and France's fault. It's not even the League of Nations at that point. But anyway, so the United Nations is formed at the end of World War II, and this time it's not just the United States as part of it, it's the United States leading and creating it. And it has proven successful in the fact that it has avoided a world war for the last 80 years. Obviously, right afterwards, you have the Cold War and several wars going on, but it's actually in both the Korean and Vietnam War. It is a UN-led coalition, which is mainly the United States fighting against North Korea and the Chinese and the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, respectively. So, anyways, a lot going on there. That's one. So there's a lot of different results for World War I. One, the colonies are starting to want to get their freedom and their independence. And two, you've got supranationalism being created with the League of Nations and this idea that there are groups that could work together with different governments of the world to create world peace. At the same time, you also have the creation of the end of the empires and the end of a century of the Europeans basically believing that they were this regal imperialist powers that were only going to get better and were only going to make the world better, and that leads everyone to question whether or not they had made the world better, because despite all of their industrialization and technology, they had devastated so many millions of lives just in that war alone. And then you have also the social effects. You have what's called the lost generation that emerges during the 1920s. Groups of young people, writers, artists. I just did my biography. I do a daily biography video on Ernest Hemingway. Before Hemingway's part of this lost generation, he drove an ambulance during World War I. So you've got that going on. But this lost generation, young people who are just even if they're not injured by the war, they are devastated by the society, and new art movements and psychological movements and philosophical movements basically say life is meaningless, and how can we just deal with this horrible amount of human suffering? It's like it's burdened onto this younger generation who fought the war and those who somehow survived it. And so you have social effects. You have all sorts of changes to the world because of World War I. And although it's a war that never should have happened and really was just motivated by pure greed and imperialist designs of different European powers, it ends up being a warning in many ways, but also changing the world forever. It ends the age of empires. It's the beginning of the end of European dominance over things. The United States emerges as a real superpower that really wasn't harmed by the war, even the way Great Britain and France were. And you also have the colonies that the Europeans used to fight for them during the war now saying, we've had enough of this, you aren't civilized enough, we need our freedom. And that slow but steady process will ramp up after World War II. And you have the creation of international organizations aimed at creating peace. And although the League of Nations failed, the United Nations is trying. And of course, in many historians' eyes, you have World War I and the Great War leading in many different ways to World War II, creating the proper environments for the rise of radical leadership such as the communists in Russia, the Nazis in Germany, and I'm trying to remember, and the fascists in Italy. And of course, you have Imperial Japan becoming more powerful and strong. So, anyways, so that's what's going on at this time. I'm going to wrap it up now. I've tried to have an hour, but my internet connection was having problems. And yes, I do have chapstick. I just forgot to use it this morning. Thank you for the reminder. I really appreciate that. Yeah. Yes, Mao, Stalin, etc. Yes, you could argue in many ways that the radicals, that communism really comes out and is able to take power in Russia, and of course it will later do so in China because of World War I and the results therein. And you can also argue that the rise of radical ideology is caused by the power vacuums and the resentments and that feeling of loss and suffering caused by World War I. So the world is really forever changed by World War I. And in that way, despite the fact that the war never should have happened and that so many millions of lives were lost, the modern world would not look the way it does without World War I. And so it's a war that we shouldn't sleep on, and we should glean lessons from and learn about. And I hope I've been able to help you learn a little bit about that and the history of presidents stepping down, obviously in the wake of the big news of Joe Biden refusing to continue his presidential bid and basically turning over the reins of power in the Democratic Party this election to Kamala Harris, who will face off against Trump most likely in November. But anyways, I hope you have enjoyed this. If you have, leave a like, subscribe, follow the channel for more content. I am uploading daily, and I look forward to our next meeting next time. It will be next Saturday, and I'm going back to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I hope to see you all then. Hope you have a great day. Take care. This is Friendly Neighborhood History checking out.